think there are two main factors which do not work in Ukraine's interest. One is, of course, that the need to defend American forces and also other countries in the Persian Gulf is going to place a demand for American air defense capabilities, which of course are very much needed in Ukraine. So I think that's one potentially negative impact for Ukraine. The other is that we have seen that with the shooting war, of course, about 20% of the oil produced in the world comes out of the Persian Gulf region. And that has caused an increase in the price of oil, and that will benefit Russia. After I think most people had concluded that 2025 was not a good year for Russian oil revenues, but it'll put the price up. So from my perspective for Ukraine, I hope the war with Iran is ended relatively quickly.
Hi everyone, welcome to 24 War and Politics YouTube channel. Today my guest is Stephen Pifer, American diplomat and former US ambassador to Ukraine. Stephen, thank you for being with us and welcome to our program.
Thank you, I'm happy to be here.
Given how rapidly world events are developing, my first question I would like to ask you, where is expected to happen a new hotbed of conflict on the planet, in your personal opinion?
Well, I think you said it exactly right. Things change quickly. You now have the American and Israeli strikes against Iran, and that has, of course, seized attention in the United States for the last 4 days.
Yeah, and actually, where is expected to happen a new hotbed of conflict on the planet, if you have any opinion about it?
Well, right now, I think there's probably enough hotbeds. I mean, it seems to me, I think that the United States, again, this is, I think, a war of choice by the American president. Now, I think it is probably a good thing both for Iranians and for the region that the Iranian regime has been set back. But it's not clear exactly how this war plays out and what impacts it might have on other American interests around the world. And I have in mind here, of course, the question of Ukraine, because I think the United States still has a vital interest in how the war between Russia and Ukraine plays out. And some of the things that are happening now in the Persian Gulf region could have an impact on what's going on between Russia and Ukraine.
Yeah, we are going to talk about this conflict, I mean Russia-Ukraine war further. But now I would like to ask you, how do you see development of war in Iran? How it could change security architecture in region, and what geopolitical consequences should we wait for?
Yeah, well, this is one of the things I think that is very hard to predict, because I believe that there's been confused statements by senior American officials as to what the objective is. Is the objective to destroy Iran's nuclear program, which, of course, President Trump said had been obliterated already last summer? Is it to destroy Iranian ballistic missile capabilities? Is it to pursue regime change, which the attacks on Iranian leadership seem to suggest? Although I think it's very difficult. I don't think there's ever been a case yet where you've seen regime change done entirely through just an air campaign. So I'm not sure at this point whether there's a fixed objective. And you hear different things from the president, from the Secretary of State, from the Secretary of Defense. So I'm not sure exactly what the United States is trying to achieve here. And of course, those goals will determine how long the conflict, or how long American participation in the conflict in Iran will take part. And of course, there's one last other point, which is that when you get into a shooting war, the other side gets a vote. And we have seen in the last several days that the Iranians have tried to expand this conflict by attacking energy and other targets throughout the Persian Gulf region.
Anyway, war is continuing, and I would like to ask you, how does war in Iran influence war in Ukraine?
Yeah, well, I think there are two main factors which do not work in Ukraine's interest. One is, of course, that the need to defend American forces and also other countries in the Persian Gulf is going to place a demand for American air defense capabilities, which of course are very much needed in Ukraine. So I think that's one potentially negative impact for Ukraine. The other is that we have seen that with the shooting war, of course, about 20% of the oil produced in the world comes out of the Persian Gulf region. And that has caused an increase in the price of oil, and that will benefit Russia. After I think most people had concluded that 2025 was not a good year for Russian oil revenues, but it'll put the price up. So from my perspective for Ukraine, I hope the war with Iran is ended relatively quickly, both so it reduces the pressure on those limited number of air defense assets, but also so that the price of oil trends down, which would reduce the oil revenues that are going to the Russian government.
You have mentioned oil prices, and actually my next question is linked to it. On the one hand, we see that oil prices are rising, and it's obviously beneficial to Russia. On the other hand, Russian shadow fleet, which is supposed to transport this oil, is under attack. According to current geopolitical and military conditions, is Russia capable of receiving enough money for war of attrition against Ukraine due to oil export?
Yeah, I'm not sure there's a specific number, but again, the lower the oil revenues that go to Russia, then that reduces pressure on the Russian budget. And I think that requires Vladimir Putin to do something that he has tried to avoid now for 4 years. Remember back in February of 2022, Putin called this a special military operation. And he told the Russian people it's a limited war. It won't have any impact on your lives. But to the extent that Russia receives less oil revenues, I think Putin is going to run into a situation where he has to make some difficult guns versus butter decisions, where sustaining the flow of money to continue the Russian war against Ukraine may require that he begin to cut back social spending inside of Russia. And I think that's, it begins to bring home to the Russian people that, in fact, this war will have an impact on their day-to-day lives.
Approximately 80% of Russian oil was imported by China and India in 2025. Every now and then, Donald Trump says that Narendra Modi convinces him that India will not buy Russian oil. In return, India will increase import from US and Venezuela. I would like to ask you, how can events develop in oil triangle Russia, China, India further? And under what circumstances this triangle can fall apart?
Yeah. Well, yeah, I have to confess I haven't followed exactly the trends between Russia and India. My perception, though, is that Indian imports of Russian oil have declined over the last several months, though I'm not sure that India has moved to completely cut them off. And this is a question that I think the Trump administration has not yet considered. Are they prepared to impose secondary sanctions on countries that import Russian oil? And I have in mind here, first and foremost, China and India, because the secondary sanctions, since so much of the oil market globally is carried out in dollars, that could cause oil traders in Russia and China, in China and India to turn away from Russia for fear that they might otherwise be excluded from the global oil market. So I think there's a potentially powerful tool there, but I'm not sure that the Trump administration has yet reached the decision to employ it.
Yeah, but actually, if I'm not mistaken, we have been talking about secondary sanctions legislation for half a year or even a year. And I would like to ask you, do you predict that we know that Donald Trump said that now government has made a decision about this legislation, but it hasn't yet. And do you believe that it will be imposed?
Well, Senator Lindsey Graham has had this legislation, I think, proposed for almost a year now. At one point last year, he said he had 85 co-sponsors in the Senate, but he's never pushed to bring it to a vote. And I tend to discount things that Senator Graham says because he is very careful. He does not want to do anything that Mr. Trump disagrees with. So because there's not been a green light from the White House to Senator Graham, he's never really pushed this legislation to a vote. And I don't think he will do so unless or until Trump gives him the green light. And again, I think this is the problem is at this point, it's not clear that Mr. Trump is prepared to use this kind of secondary sanction tool.
Yeah, and actually, I would like to ask you, in your opinion, why does Donald Trump, why is Donald Trump not ready to do it right now?
I wish I knew. And I think this really is a question to pose to a psychologist. I've seen one theory, which is that Mr. Trump tends to be kind of a bully. Bullies tend to have an affinity for strong men. And there does seem to be this strange affinity that Mr. Trump holds for Vladimir Putin. But it's very difficult to understand. And the problem here is that I think, you've seen Mr. Trump now engaged for over a year in an effort to try to mediate a solution to the Russian and Ukraine war. I don't think that mediation effort is succeeding. I think it is failing, and it will continue, and it will ultimately fail unless Mr. Trump is prepared to back his diplomacy with pressure on Moscow. Because when you look at the course of the discussions over the past year, I believe that Ukraine has indicated flexibility in the negotiations. It is prepared perhaps even to take decisions regarding territory that will be very painful. But I've seen no significant movement by the Russians. And so if Mr. Trump does not put pressure on Moscow, and I think he has lots of ways he could increase the pressure on Moscow, Moscow has really no incentive to change its course. And unfortunately, I think Vladimir Putin still thinks he can achieve his goals on the battlefield. Mr. Trump has not done much to disabuse Putin of that idea and get Putin to think that he will fail on the battlefield, and therefore he needs to negotiate in a serious way to end this conflict. And that's a failure of Mr. Trump's.
Yeah, during his meeting with Donald Trump, German Chancellor Friedrich Merz said that Europe will not allow any decision on Ukraine to be made without European participation. And also, German Chancellor showed Ukrainian map to Trump to convince that front line must not be changed. Otherwise, road to Kiev will be opened again for Russians.
Yeah.
How do you assess Mertz's visit, and how do you understand current frame of US-EU relations?
Well, I think I think it was very important that Chancellor Merz made those points when he was at the White House yesterday, and it's been sort of a mystery to me why the Trump administration has not moved to involve the Europeans more directly, because if you look at the ideas that the Trump administration has for settling the war, a lot of the implementation falls on Europe. And I remember Secretary George Shultz, the Secretary of State during the Reagan administration, he used to say, if you want people in with you when you land the plane, you have to have them in at the start. And so I think that the administration should be engaging the Europeans more closely, because in their plans, they want Europe to do a lot. And my guess is that Europeans will be more prepared to do things if they're involved in the negotiations and if they're involved in the planning from the start.
Syria, Venezuela, Iran, Russia has been losing its allies. How does this affect Putin's intentions and capabilities? I mean, can current geopolitical situation become a game changer in war in Ukraine?
Well, no, I think what you've seen is that this is yet another display of Kremlin impotence. And it goes back to the fall of Syria, or the fall of the Assad regime in Syria in December of 2024, where even though there were Russian military forces in Syria, they stood by as Assad fell by the wayside. In June of 2025, when American aircraft conducted the airstrikes against Iran's nuclear facilities. You saw the Russians criticize the action, but they did nothing. Likewise, in Venezuela in January, after American forces seized Mr. Maduro's, I think it was Foreign Minister Lavrov expressed solidarity with the people of Venezuela, but there was no action. And I think the problem here is that Vladimir Putin is so obsessed with Ukraine that, and so much of the Russian military operations are now tied up with Ukraine, that there's very little appetite in Moscow and very little capability to try to project power far beyond Russian borders. So, and I think one other factor here is that I believe that Vladimir Putin has successfully played Donald Trump for months now, in terms of Putin does not have an intention to negotiate seriously, but he goes through the motions to try to keep the American administration from applying more sanctions on Russia. And so he's trying to be a bit restrained there. But again, you have a situation where Russian partners around the world, I think, having viewed what's happened in Syria, what's happened in Venezuela, what's happening in Iran, have to be asking themselves, what kind of support could they expect from Russia if they got into any kind of serious trouble?
We see that axis of evil is falling apart, but China seems to remain the main character. I would like to hear from you your expectations from the upcoming Donald Trump and Xi Jinping meeting. What outcome can be?
I'm not smart enough to try to make that prediction, because I think if you look at the past year, you have seen all sorts of views within the Trump administration with regards to China. So I just don't know what is going to come out of that meeting.
I got you. And I would like to ask you about potential participation of China in the peace talks, because during his meeting with Friedrich Merz, Xi stated that there has to be provided equal participation of all parties in peace talks. After this statement, some experts said that China can join to trilateral peace talks between US, Russia, and Ukraine. How do you assess possibility of Chinese participation, and under what conditions it could happen?
Look, I do not think there is any foreign leader in the world who has greater influence than Vladimir Putin, than President Xi of China. But if you look over the past 4 years, I don't think you've seen any serious evidence that Mr. Xi has used that influence to try to bring Russia to end the war. I don't think China has pursued a very responsible policy. China's support for the defense industrial base in Russia has been a big factor in Russia being able to sustain its military operations in Ukraine. So although I think Mr. Xi has huge potential, he has not used it, and I don't think that he is going to be a factor in trying to bring about an early end of this war. That's unfortunate, because I think it would be a way for China to show that it is prepared to be a responsible actor on the world stage, but nothing in the past 4 years suggests that Mr. Xi is prepared to play that role.
Mm-hmm. But anyway, let's imagine it happens. What does Chinese participation indicate for Washington, Kyiv, and Moscow?
Well, I think, again, it would depend upon exactly how China does participate. As I said, nobody in the world has more influence with Vladimir Putin, or no foreign leader has more influence with Vladimir Putin than President Xi. If President Xi became involved in the negotiations and was prepared to use that influence to push Moscow to begin to negotiate in a serious way, that could potentially be extremely useful. I mean, if you look at the Russian negotiating position, I don't think you've seen any significant change in the Russian position from that articulated by President Putin in the summer of 2024. Look in the last 2 months, what Foreign Minister Lavrov has said, what Kremlin spokesperson Peskov has said. When they list the conditions, it goes back to 2024, and there's no movement. So if Xi were to get involved and were prepared to push the Russians to negotiate in a serious way, that could be potentially very important. But I do not think the odds of Xi doing that are very high.
Mm-hmm. And Stephen, if I understood you correctly, you don't believe in any positive outcome when it comes to current negotiation process. I mean, trilateral peace talks.
I think the current American effort to broker a solution between Russia and Ukraine on its present course is failing, and it will fail. And the fault of that lies with President Trump, who has not backed his diplomacy with leverage. What could Trump do? He could increase sanctions pressure on Russia. He could, for example, close the loopholes that allow American high tech to get through the sanctions and get into Russia and be incorporated into Russian missiles, which then strike Ukraine. I think he could do more. And you've seen, I think, some positive steps in terms of dealing with the Russian tanker shadow tanker fleet, but you could put more pressure on that. Also, he could work with the Europeans, I think, in a more forceful way to try to overcome Belgian objections and allow use of the Russian frozen central bank assets to support Ukraine. If you took those assets and put them in a fund to support Ukraine, the message to Moscow would be that Ukraine has the resources to buy the weapons it needs for another 2, 3, possibly 4 years. And then Putin has to ask himself, does he want to continue a war where he's losing, 350, 400,000 people a year for at best marginal gains in territory? And finally, if Trump wanted to send a really strong signal to Moscow, he'd ask Congress for 25 or 30 billion dollars in military assistance to help support Ukraine. There are things that he could do that I think would get the attention of the Kremlin and could force Putin to consider his current course and perhaps get Putin to negotiate in a serious way to end this war. But he's really been reluctant and has not applied any of that leverage on Moscow. And without that leverage, I fear his mediation effort is going to fail.
Yeah, Stephen, and my last question, actually, you have partially responded on it, but I would like to ask it. What is the biggest fear of Putin right now?
I think it's hard to say what Putin's fear is. I mean, he does not, he's been very careful, I think, to avoid doing things that would antagonize Donald Trump. So, for example, if you see the bulk of the criticism after Venezuela and Iran, it comes less from Putin and more from people like Lavrov and Peskov, because he is still trying to preserve that relationship. I think Putin believes that he can keep Trump in his corner and at least prevent the American president from applying more sanctions on Russia. He doesn't want to lose that. Now, if he loses that, and if Trump wakes up one morning and says, I am tired of being gamed, being strung along by Putin, I'm going to take some serious steps, I think that greatly changes the picture for the Kremlin. He can no longer hope that without American support, it will be harder for Ukraine to sustain the fight just based on European support. And I will be here very much praising the Europeans, who I think are stepping in to try to fill as much of the gap as possible. But that kind of pressure, if Trump were to make a change, could cause Putin to reassess and perhaps look at a way to end this war. But that all depends really on the White House and whether the White House is prepared to use the tools it has to increase the pressure on Moscow.
Stephen, thank you very much for your time, for this interview, and for your expertise. Appreciate it. Thank you, and have a good day.
Thank you. Good evening.